It can be incredibly hard to have an idea that's totally and completely unique, and in a 50-year-old industry with new games constantly being placed under labels like Metroidvania and Souls-like, it can be almost impossible to see something that's truly new. All of which is why it hurts even more when a game does have something that feels fresh, a concept that is downright genius, only for the game itself to waste it. From brand new franchises and new developers to more established names and studios, no one is safe from ruining a fantastic concept. These are just a few titles that have suffered this fate. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that wasted brilliant concepts. Number 10. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is a very strange video game. Rare took the platformer icons and developed a gameplay system all around creating and customizing vehicles, needing to alter them depending on the type of level or challenge you needed to complete. For example, if you needed to focus on speed, you needed to make your car small. If you have to transport stuff, you need to create a basket on top of your vehicle. It was incredibly rewarding to complete a mission knowing that your customization choices is why you were able to do it. The system was clever, and while the missions could be a bit wonky from time to time, it was rewarding. So why was the game such a disappointment? Simple. It wasn't a real Banjo-Kazooie game. This was the Bear and Bird's first new adventure under the Microsoft banner after they purchased Rare, and it had been 8 years since the last main game. Having the first new Banjo-Kazooie after all that time be a game that abandoned its platforming roots made a lot of people very understandably upset. The vehicle creation wasn't enough to sway them, and they just couldn't get out of the shadow of fans' expectations. The franchise the game was in is what ultimately ruined it, and it wasn't until their addition to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate where Banjo and Kazooie would return to the spotlight. Number 9. Never Dead. Did you know that Konami used to make and publish video games? It's true, you may have even heard of some of them. Yet there's a good chance you never heard of Never Dead. Released in 2012 for the PS3 and Xbox 360, Never Dead had an incredibly interesting hook. You played as an immortal being that couldn't die. If you took damage, instead of dying, you'd get dismembered, losing arms and legs until you were just a head rolling around. Sometimes this helped with puzzles, but most of the time it was a way to make combat more tense as you tried to pull yourself back together while dodging bullets. However, this interesting concept was all the game had. The story was bad, the characters were at best boring and at worst unlikable, and the combat was incredibly clunky. Everything outside of the idea was a disaster, and the game never got a follow-up because of it. Hopefully the interesting immortality mechanic gets picked up by another game in the future, because with some tweaking, it could be really fun. Number 8. The Order 1886. There's a good chance that if this game was better, The Order would have been a mainstay PlayStation franchise from its setting alone. Taking place in an alternate history Victorian England where technology had advanced well past what the time period should have had, the game follows the Knights of the Round Table as they fight off monsters such as werewolves and vampires. The premise is fantastic, and nothing else quite like it was out at the time. In fact, this game came out a month before Bloodborne, the only other game that could be compared to the Order's world and setting on the console. But the game itself was a letdown. While the world and presentation was immaculate, the gameplay was much too simple, the length of the game was much too short, and the story didn't make full use of its inspired setting. On top of that, The Order wasn't nearly as interactive as it should have been, falling back on quick-time events over active gameplay. Number 7. Absolver. You may have heard of an indie game called Sifu, where you play as a martial artist in possession of a magic amulet that revives them at an older age whenever they die. Sifu had critical and commercial success, getting 1 million copies sold in only a few months. But before that, developer Slowclap had released another game called Absolver, and it was a hand-to-hand multiplayer combat game that was overall very interesting and original. Basically, you roamed the world to find other players to fight, and as you fought them, you learned their attacks, adding to your moveset with every fight. It was a fantastic idea, basically creating a level system without having a level system, and making the multiplayer world feel interactive, rewarding you for engaging in it. The issue was, Absolver is a multiplayer game, and multiplayer games need players to function. The game was unique, but also niche, and because of that, the player base was so small that the game quickly lost its appeal of fighting others found in the world. Luckily, Sifu seems to have Slowclap back on track, and seeing what great ideas the developers will come up with in the future is exciting. Number 6. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. Resident Evil is one of the most influential and iconic video game franchises of all time. However, while the highs of the series are very high, the lows of the series are so low that they hit the bedrock. Which leads us to Operation Raccoon City, a game which does something that other Resident Evil games just didn't do: focus on some of the bad guys of the game, Umbrella. Set during the events of Resi 2 and 3, Raccoon City focuses on an Umbrella task force, showing what the evil organization was doing during this time, and even showing some what-if scenarios with the team taking down Leon and Claire. Unfortunately, the premise was trapped in a low-quality third-person shooter, made to be played in co-op with terrible AI replacing the spots you weren't able to convince enough of your friends to fill. It was a bland action shooter with very little focus on horror. The story also didn't live up to the premise, just being used as an excuse to go forward and shoot more zombies. After this disappointment, Capcom would try something similar years later with Umbrella Corps, and the less said about that, the better. Number 5. Murdered Sole Suspect. How they messed up a ghost detective trying to solve his own murder while dealing with demons is the real mystery here, as somehow Square Enix found a way. Having an absolutely stellar idea, Murdered Sole Suspect just doesn't do as much with the premise as it could have. Being able to walk through walls for clues and possess people for interrogations is a phenomenal idea, but in a game like this, the lack of freedom is incredibly obvious. You can only walk through so many walls as there are places blocked off, there are demon fights to be had that quickly become boring after your third time, and on top of that, it's an incredibly short title with a mystery in zero danger of not being solved. The only way you don't find out who the killer was is if you turn off the game halfway through, and honestly, nobody would blame you. Number 4. CHOCOBO GP. The newest game on this list, CHOCOBO GP, came out on March 10th, 2022, and quickly made a lot of people very angry. On paper, this should have been a slam dunk. A kart racer from one of the most beloved and revered franchises in video game history, able to take any characters from its long and illustrious history and throw them into racing mayhem? How could that possibly go wrong? By having some incredibly terrible monetization practices. That's how. At an initial purchase of $50 US, the game was filled to the brim with annoyances, having an in-game currency that you can only get by spending real-world money, and an incredibly frustrating battle pass that locks characters like Cloud from Final Fantasy VII behind days of gameplay. Of course, that grind could be offset by purchasing in-game currency to speed things along. After a loud outcry on social media, the developers have made some balance changes to make things easier to unlock, as well as added in-game currency as a real unlockable, but the damage seems to have already been done. It's a shame, as this idea could have been a real blast under better circumstances. Number 3. The Quiet Man. The third and last Square Enix game on this list, The Quiet Man, is just weird, no question about it. The game had received interest for one real reason. Its main character was deaf, and as such, the game would be almost completely silent with no subtitles. It was an interesting narrative device, and one that could have been really successful if it was done properly. Keyword there being if. For whatever reason, the developers decided to still write a story with live-action cutscenes, framed like a normal game with sound, making it so that the player, sat forever in silence, had no idea what was happening. The problems just got worse when they suddenly introduced supernatural elements, ruining any chance people had of following along. Eventually, audio for the game was added in an update, but even with knowing what was happening, The Quiet Man just wasn't any good. Combat was bland, and unfortunately, this was the only real gameplay present. Number 2. Sonic Forces. If you're a Sonic fan and have ever been online, first off, hopefully you haven't been too emotionally scarred, and secondly, you've probably seen how many original characters have been created because of the series. If you haven't, here's a fun game. Google your first name, then add the hedgehog at the end to see what pops up. Maybe put on that safe search if you don't want to be scarred. With so many original characters littering the internet for decades now, the idea of adding a character creator in Sonic Forces was a stroke of genius, putting you alongside the likes of Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and the rest of the cast and crew while fighting off Eggman after he finally conquers the world. The issue is that Sonic Forces, like most modern Sonic games, just wasn't good. Boost gameplay was simpler and more boring than ever, the levels are blink and you'll miss them quick, and the story is nonsensical, even for the blue blur. It was a very poor game, and the character creation idea may unfortunately never reappear in the Sonic franchise again because of it. Number 1. Anthem. Where do you even begin with Anthem? Created by BioWare and announced in 2017, Anthem immediately got people's attention thanks to its cinematic trailer, showing off what gameplay was supposed to look like. Flying through a jungle with an almost Iron Man-like flair and fighting off aliens with friends was a concept that was so exciting. Going quickly from the air to the ground in a huge sci-fi setting was something that so many people wanted, and the excitement for this game was sky high because of it. But BioWare just couldn't live up to those expectations thanks to a now infamously rocky development. While the general flight and combat felt great, the lack of story, the lack of content, and the over-reliance on grinding for loot made it a slog to get through, and the many annoyances and technical issues on top of that during its launch window quickly evaporated any excitement people had for the game. The player base for the game quickly died down, and now all that's left of the game is a bunch of questions of what could have been. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other video games that wasted brilliant concepts. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I am @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming content.